In this next video then, I'm going to try and make a sort of transitionary path between recording Visual Basic Code and writing Visual Basic Code. So when you first start to work with Visual Basic in Excel, probably what you're doing is using the macro recorder, as we've seen in the previous videos. You're using the macro recorder in this kind of way to record a new macro. If we double click on module 1 there, then we can see here is the macro being recorded into module 1 in the Visual Basic project associated with the workbook that I'm using here. So I'm just going to enter my name and address into the worksheet. In the another one of the previous videos, I discussed using the relative reference button here when you're recording to have your cell selection be relative to some kind of point of origin. So let's press the relative reference button in. I think you'll see why in just a second. And what I'm going to do is put my name and address into the worksheet. So I'll say Andrew Binden, flat 1, 4 Pepper Street, Isle of Dogs, and that's in London, and some fictitious postcode which I'm making up. And then I'll stop the recorder, and let's just have a look at what the macro recorder did for me in the first instance here. So first off, I had range B2 selected. That was the first thing I did when I started recording the macro. And then as I had the relative reference button pushed in, every time I moved down one row to enter the next piece of my address into the worksheet, you can see it's entered this instruction: active cell offset 1 0, 1 meaning one row down. If I'd gone across some columns, I'd see a number in there as well. That's for the columns, but the offset 1, that's rows and then columns, so 1 row and 0 columns. So it's moved the cell pointer down 1 row and 1 column, and then it's entered into the cell that we've just selected, the active cell. It's entered into the active cell the text that I've typed, and the macro recorder has nicely recorded that right into the macro for me. So as I said at the beginning, the point of this little video is really to see some sort of transitionary path between recording Visual Basic Code and writing Visual Basic Code, and alongside that, hopefully, to give you some incentive for wanting to write rather than record. And perhaps one thing that you might see straight away here is that the code that the Visual Basic macro recorder has recorded isn't necessarily the easiest code to read, and that might be perhaps one of the first reasons that you might want to think about writing code rather than simply recording it. So I'm just going to take a copy of what the macro recorder gave me first off and paste it into the module 1 straight underneath. So this first macro that I recorded, I'm going to call that my name underscore recorded, and so this is going to be my name edit edit 1. And as it wasn't recorded, I'm just going to take these comments out, all of that stuff which was supplied, as you can see, in the original macro by the macro recorder. I don't need it in my edit. It would be nice, wouldn't it, if each of these instructions to move my cell pointer down one row and then insert the next piece of text, you might wonder, if you looked at this for long enough, do I really need to have a separate instruction for moving the cell pointer and then inserting text into the new cell that's been selected? And the answer is no. Perhaps not surprisingly. So starting off with the active cell formula R1C1, I'm just going to say active cell offset 1, 0. I don't really need to select the next cell. All I really need to do is insert the next piece of text into it. So if I take out each piece of these lines, you can see we can close up what was originally about 8 lines, 2 lines in other words for every entry I'm wanting to make on the worksheet, can now become 1 line. I don't really need to start from B2 in particular. That's just happened to be where I did start from. In the general case, I might just want to start from wherever I happen to be. So we don't need to have any specification about B2, so I'll take that out. We don't especially need to go selecting any cell after we've entered the name and address into the worksheet. So I'll take that line out as well. Now, this first edit that I've done, as yet it isn't actually going to work as well as you might hope, and we'll talk about why not as soon as we see what it actually does. So for those of you who are aware of the problem with this, don't worry, I'm aware of it too. But let's just see what this first edit has achieved already. Now, in order to run the macro here, in a separate video I'm going to tell you about 9 or 10 different ways that you can run your macros, but one of the most convenient ways you can do it whilst you're in the process of editing a particular macro and working on it, one of the most convenient ways is actually that you can run it directly from the editor window. You can either click the Run button here inside the editor window, or if I just bring in my debug toolbar, we can click this button here, which will step into the macro and execute it 1 line at a time. So this Run button that I just mentioned will execute the whole macro. This button here, the Step Into button, will execute the macro 1 line at a time. So let's just try running the macro first off and see what happens. Well, and this is what I'm saying, that the macro hasn't quite given me everything that I wanted from it. It's given me my name and it's given me my bogus postcode, but it hasn't given me the other lines in between, and I might want to know why in particular. And so let's pick another cell a bit further down, and this time try the Step Into button. So rather than executing the whole macro all at once, we'll execute 1 line at a time of the macro as we step through. So I'll say Step Into, and you see that the highlighting, the first line of the macro is highlighted as I clicked the Step Into button. I'll click it again to move to the first line of the macro. And working on the active cell then, you can see I'm setting the formula R1C1 to the text as I typed it originally. So I'll click the Step button. The highlighting then moves down to the next line and the text is entered into the worksheet cell. So I'll click the Step button again, and things at this stage are looking pretty positive because I've got my name, I've got the first line of my address has been entered into the row below, active cell offset 1, 0. I'm about to enter this the second line of my address into what I'm hoping is going to be the cell below again. Remember, I just got all of this code by making a sort of a compaction of the codes in that the recorder originally gave me. The problem with this code, though, as I execute the next line, we'll see, is that the next line, Isle of Dogs, this text here, is being entered on top of the first line, flat 1 for Pepper Street. So not quite what I want, and then I step again and I see the same thing happens with the third line of my address, and the same thing happens with the postcode. Things aren't really too bad though. Even so, this contraction that I made of the code that the editor had originally given me isn't working too badly. But the thing that we can see here is that the offset of 1 starting from the active cell, what's happened here is that the active cell has not moved. In the thing that the recorder recorded, because we kept on selecting another row down each time, the active cell was therefore a different cell, and offsetting 1, 1 from that gave me an additional row each time. So the effect of taking out the select statements here and not moving the cell pointer down each time has meant that this active cell has not moved, and therefore offsetting 1 from it has only moved me down 1 row. But there's an easy way to deal with that, which I expect you've already guessed, and that is to change the numbers in the code so that we offset 1 row, 2 rows, 3 rows, and 4 rows. So let's try running the macro again, and we can see that now it gives us the same result as the recorded code. But here's the thing: not only does it give us the same result as the recorded code, but it gives us that result in half the number of written code lines, and half the number of written code lines, for a start, that's going to make your code run more efficiently, but also if you think about working with a very big macro, if you've got half the number of code lines to work with, then it's going to be a lot easier to find your way around. So one of the things that you might want to start thinking about is how to make your Visual Basic code as convenient as possible for you to work with and manage in the long term. And obviously by having less code, that means there's less code for you to manage, less code for you to find your way around, less code for you to edit. And at the same time, another advantage of having less code is that less code is typically more efficient code. Less code typically runs faster. So, and there's another reason for the efficiency in this particular case, and that is that we haven't had to move the cell pointer each time before inserting the text into the next cell. So there's a whole number of reasons why the edited code that we've come up with is a big improvement over the recorded code that we originally recorded. Now we can go much further with this, but I was just wanting to create a single step, if you like, one step in the direction, in the transition between recording Visual Basic code and editing Visual Basic code and writing Visual Basic code. As we'll come on to see, probably the best Visual Basic code you're going to get, you're either going to download from somewhere or you're going to write it yourself. Ultimately, the macro recorder is not going to give you the best code you can get, and we'll talk more about that as we proceed in the next videos.